afternoon, everybody. My name is Pete Baldwin. I'm a partner with the law firm Faegre, Drinker, Biddle, and Reith, and it is my privilege to moderate the final panel of today's session. I think it's a really interesting and timely panel for everybody in attendance, and what we're going to be talking about here today is building confidence in your cybersecurity program. We have an esteemed group of panelists to talk to you today, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started, because I know we are also, as the last panel between you and your cocktail hour, so we want to finish on time. So maybe we'll start down at the end of the table with Wes.
Hi, I'm Wes Stillman. I'm with Right Size Solutions, founder. We started in 2002. We strictly are IT as a service for the wealth management community, advisors specifically for that. So I know my bio's out there. I'd love to talk to each of you as we get through this. So thanks for coming in.
Hi, I'm Maria Chambers. I'm Chief Compliance Officer of Klingenstein Fields Advisors. We are a wealth advisor based in New York City. We have about $4.5 billion in AUM, primarily a high net worth client base. And yeah, I'm very excited to be on this panel as well.
Hi, I'm David Jouar. I'm a senior special counsel in the SEC's Division of Investment Management. And prior to joining the SEC, I was in private practice doing investment management work.
So we've broken the discussion today down into three principal parts, and each of our panelists is going to take the lead with respect to those parts. We're going to talk a little bit about the current threat environment first, and then we're going to move on to regulatory developments, and then we're going to move into the world of what you can do and what your company can do in terms of compliance, defenses, and operational resiliency. So why don't we kick it off, Wes, with you. Can you talk about sort of what the threat environment looks like today for the folks who are in attendance at the conference? What are the major threats out there? What should people be most concerned about as it relates to cybersecurity?
Thanks. So the obvious answer is ransomware, fraudulent transactions. Those are the top key threats that are out there, spawned by phishing and email and giving up your credentials. But for me, my opinion, I think the biggest threat isn't necessarily the attack itself, but what happens after the attack. All right? There's a lot of money that has to go into that and a lot of activity that will occur after an attack. So everything you can do to prevent an attack is necessary, has to be done, but the threat really exists once it happens, right? If you don't have cybersecurity insurance today, you will as you renew your insurance. How many of you know that happens today, right? And it's not a simple task. So cyber insurance has to be there, and that'll help a lot on the backside if it happens.
So curious, Wes, because obviously we're now no longer in a position where cybersecurity is something that businesses and individuals can credibly say, you know, I don't know that there's a risk, or I don't understand that there's a risk. Why is it that you think issues like ransomware and some of the other more common cyber attacks remain such a problem? Is it just a matter of businesses like investment advisors being high-value targets? Is it a sense that even though people understand the threat, they don't take it seriously? Or is it more an economic sort of cost-benefit decision that businesses take and say, look, I understand it's out there, but I don't have the funds to put in place everything that I need to put in place to be fully defensed?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Budget has got to be number one for cybersecurity, but I don't think it's a matter of people ignoring it. If you are, you probably aren't going to be in business very long. It is a matter, though, of understanding and education, right? What is really required to protect my business? I don't know about you guys, I'm a technology guy, and I got in the business not to be a money manager, right? So I doubt many of you got in the business to be technologists. There has to be some experts to help you understand what those risks are, how to mitigate them within the framework of your business, right? Well, the risks are the same for everybody. How you mitigate them depends on your business and what you can afford and what you're willing to accept as a risk within your business. But the risks are the same across the board.
So one of the things, or one of the trends that I've noticed as we work with clients who have been victimized by cybersecurity incidents, Wes, is we're seeing a lot of incidents arise, not necessarily at the client themselves, but increasingly with vendors or business partners of the clients. So sort of a secondary or tertiary risk that emanates from a separate organization. How can companies prepare for these types of cybersecurity risks? That is to say, it's not their own business necessarily, but the folks that they work with. What would you recommend in terms of being prepared for incidents like that?
I think that's a good question. I also think, and we'll talk some more about new rules, but proposed rules, the fact is, it's your business and you have to manage your vendors, right? So understanding what they do, how they do it, what their procedures are, policies, how they're enforcing that is really important. I would break it down into a couple of areas. Software as a service, so your fintech stack, right? CRMs, portfolio management, custodial services, that type of thing. That is one area that you have to do due diligence on, focus more on what their development process is. Is it offshore, onshore? What are their controls around software development? IT as a service providers like RightSize, there's no doubt about it. It's a different set of criteria, similar to yours. What are our procedures, policies? How do we enforce them? Are we self-managing that? Do we do a security risk assessment every year? Do you have a SOC? Those are the type of things you need to be reviewing and really kind of partner with that vendor and understand what it is they're doing for you, how they're doing it, and how they're protecting that. The fact of the matter is, technology isn't flawless, right? So SolarWinds is a really good example of that. That flaw existed for a long time. Never got exploited until recently, right? It can happen, and it will happen. And it depends on how well you know your vendors and how transparent they are. Are they immediately telling you, hey, there's a problem, right? That's a partnership that you have to develop.
So I think it probably seems obvious, but one of the things that you need to have in order to adequately prepare your business for the threats that are out there is knowledge of what those threats are. And are there resources that you recommend to investment advisors or similar type businesses in terms of monitoring and recommending that people stay abreast of threats through these type of resources? What do you recommend people take a look at?
First of all, a good partner, right? Good IT provider for you that is knowledgeable not only of your industry, they're not your compliance team, they have to work with your compliance team. So whether that's in-house or outsourced, it takes a team to make sure you have things covered. But a couple of really good resources, and I'm old, I got to put my glasses on. The NIST.gov website, and I'm happy to publish it out later, but there's a really good article in there about small business information security. And what it does is it nets out in plain English what NIST is all about, what that framework is about, and it will help you understand kind of what really needs to be put in place for those protections. I'd also mention the CISA site, CISA. that has really good resources that you guys can begin to educate yourselves on, and the details can be provided by your IT provider. But it gives you some common language to start talking around.
So last question as it relates to the threat environment, Wes. You've talked about sort of the present major threats that are out there, and you've highlighted ransomware, which I think is not a surprise to anybody in the room. Looking into the crystal ball over the course of the next year or 2 years, do you still see ransomware as being sort of the major threat to businesses like investment advisors? Do you see other threats evolving? And I guess the second part of that question is, in light of what you're seeing out there in the threat landscape, what 1, 2, 3 key recommendations would you give to businesses right now? What should they absolutely do?
Great questions. The landscape is really simple. There's about 3 organizations in the world that are responsible for 90% of all ransomware attacks, whether you know it or not. And they're not state-sponsored. These guys are really good. It's estimated that that business, the criminal aspect of this, is about a $600 billion a year business. Make no mistake about it, it's a business. I can go buy software off the dark web to go after any one of your businesses. And if I need help, I can pay for it and they'll help me do it. It's a business. So do I think it's going to go away? No, it's going to get worse. And it's getting more sophisticated. It's not just a matter of locking up your files. They spend, IBM said they're in there about, give or take, 230 some odd days before they execute anything, right? There is software and technology that's already there. It's available, right? We use it, it's there. Artificial intelligence and huge amounts of data points that let us analyze, predict, and look at behavior within computers, not just signatures anymore, your antivirus. This is actual behavior that's happening in there. So when you give away those credentials, we know it, and we know what that behavior is, and we can begin to predict and be proactive and shut it down. So it's not like it's hopeless, right? The United States has spent more on cybersecurity experts than anybody in the country, or in the world, pardon me. So we have the technology, we have the expertise. You have to be willing to invest in it and invest in partners to make that happen. If you don't do anything else today, when you walk out, if you're not using multi-factor authentication on everything you do, that would be the one recommendation I would have. Right? First line of defense.
That's great, and I would echo that too. And I think, not only is it a good recommendation, but it's something that, at least from a regulatory perspective and a liability perspective, is something that is becoming expected. And so to the extent you're not doing that, you're opening yourself up to liability, both from a regulatory and potential litigation perspective if you suffer an attack. So let's sort of transition there to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment and what is going on. And I think, clearly the elephant in the room here is the new proposed rules, proposed cybersecurity rules that relate specifically to investment advisors. And so, David, maybe we turn it over to you. Could you talk a little bit about the new proposed rules, some of the requirements that are, that are going to go into place if those rules are adopted, and just sort of walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So the proposed rules and rule amendments really have 4 components. The first component is reasonably designed policies and procedures to address a firm's cybersecurity risks. Those policies and procedures need to contain, as proposed, certain requirements, and that would include a risk assessment, a user security and access requirement, an information protection element, a threat and vulnerability management element, and then finally an incident response and recovery element. So that's what the policies and procedures, at a minimum, would need to address. They are outlined, actually, if you read our proposal, which I'm sure everybody in this room has already done so. I suggest you actually go and read the rules, if you're an attorney, or not. Go and read the back end first, and then read sort of the text or the narrative in the front. I think you'll get a better idea of what we're trying to accomplish. The second element, or one of the main second elements, is there's a reporting requirement, and that's Form ADVC that would be filed by an investment advisor if they are subject to a significant cybersecurity attack that affects them, their private fund clients, or their registered investment company client or business development company clients. So they would have to report if they meet that definitional trigger to the SEC on a confidential basis, and there's certain information that's elicited in that form, such as the scope and nature of the incident, what the firm is doing in response to that incident, or what they're planning to do, whether they've disclosed the incident to their clients. So it asks for a specific type of information at the time that the advisor realizes that it has been subject to a significant cyber attack, and it has to do so, within 48 hours. So there's a timing element to that. Again, it's confidential. It would be only to the SEC. There is a disclosure component that's different, separate from the reporting component. The reporting component asks for a fair amount of information to be provided to the commission. And then there's also the third element is there's a disclosure component. That's the brochure component, the Form ADV Part 2 brochure component, which would require that you disclose certain types of cybersecurity incidents to your clients. And there's also a risk component. That's just a general disclosure component that's new to Form ADV Part 2.
And so I want to follow up on that, but I would get in trouble if I didn't do this now, and I had forgotten before, but just to let folks know that this session is eligible for continuing education credit. If you'd like credit for attending, you're going to have to write down code words. I'm going to give you the first code word right now. If I'm remembering, I will give you the second code word before we end. I'm sure somebody will yell at me if I don't, but the first code word for today is terrific. That is terrific.
Right. And also, speaking of getting in trouble, I also forgot to give you my disclaimer. So my remarks today reflect solely my personal views and do not necessarily reflect the views of the commission, the individual members of the commission, or its staff.
So, with that caveat, curious, and I understand, David, you're somewhat limited in terms of what you can say about the rationale behind the new proposed rule, but I'm wondering if you could comment on whether you thought part of the reasoning for bringing the rule now was it a perception at the commission that that investment advisors weren't acting appropriately on their own? That is to say, they weren't taking these threats seriously, they weren't reporting as needed, or was it simply that the view was that other regulators and other agencies had similar reporting requirements in place, and the SEC was going to do this to be relatively consistent with other regulators out there? Curious if there's any sort of background or rationale here, so we understand sort of why the rule is coming out now and why it is what it is.
Right. Well, as the commission stated in the release, they didn't believe, or at least the commission thought, that there was no industry-wide practice with respect to cyber. So this is generally based on what examinations has been seeing for a fair amount of years. There's risk alerts of exams the Division of Examinations has been putting out, I think since 2015, or 2014 when they first issued their risk alerts. So there's been sort of a crescendo of what they've been seeing in the industry. They've been alerting or informing the industry of what the staff has been seeing in alerts, and also in a paper that was issued in January 2020 of what they thought were areas that they highlighted for the industry to focus on. So I think the commission, based on what exams has been seeing for a fair amount of time, has finally decided to put into place a rule, and it's a rule that takes into account the specific nature of everybody's business, because not all advisors or funds are the same. So these need to be tailored based upon the particulars of the particular investment advisor's business. So I think it's been a long time coming. I can't say that. Is it pursuant to certain staff examinations? I think it's what the commission stated in the proposed release, and it cites to a fair amount of risk alerts. And there's been a fair amount of recent ones also before the proposed rule came out, for instance, on credential stuffing and on ransomware, and what to do or where to go, what to look at, including areas such as looking at the NIST website, which is a government website, and also CISA, which is part of Homeland Security, which also actually puts out some interesting and useful information, including for small businesses.
If you don't mind, let me jump in a minute. It's also not just the SEC. Many states have adopted some pretty demanding reporting requirements around cybersecurity as well. So it isn't just that. So it's broader than just the SEC putting these rules in place.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I mean, I think, certainly the rules are more onerous than no rules. But I think to some extent, Wes, you're right. They are consistent with other rules and regulations that we are seeing for other industries. I do a lot of work with the New York Department of Financial Services, and there are similar reporting requirements there. There are other state agencies and other agencies that require similarly quick and onerous levels of reporting. And so I don't think it's anything that's sort of out of line with what we're seeing in the regulatory environment.
And may I say something just with regard to, for example, the federal rules won't preempt the state rules, and in a lot of states, there's a distinction between what type of breach requires notification. There are distinctions in the definition of what constitutes access, among other terms. So it is quite a bear, because you have to wrap your arms around all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no doubt that reporting regulations are a lawyer's dream, right? There are many of them out there. They are complex. They are not necessarily consistent. And so you're absolutely right, Maria. I mean, it is tough to make sure that you are staying up to date with everything that applies to you. And I think this will only add to that complication. So, David, I think the natural progression here, and you've highlighted the issue of examinations and risk alerts that have been coming out that are focused in the cyberspace over the course of the last few years. And I think folks are definitely aware of a movement in that direction and seeing more activity in the cyberspace there. And curious how that might translate in the enforcement space, because naturally what flows through examinations and what we see in some of the guidance that comes out of the SEC, often we will see later in enforcement. And obviously, we're not asking you to comment on anything in particular, but to the extent there is some sense within the SEC that cyber is going to be an area of focus with respect to enforcement. We'd be curious to hear about that as well.
Well, I can't say whether it's going to be a specific focus of enforcement. What I can say is exams has a unit not dedicated purely to cyber, but that looks at cyber. and operational resiliency. And then enforcement now has a cyber unit, and that's been around since 2017. So that just gives you an idea that there is a focus in this area. And exams, as part of their priorities, for quite some time now, has focused on cyber. Now, whether that'll translate into enforcement actions, I can't say. I mean, I think you can get an inkling of what perhaps the SEC was focused on. There were the more recent enforcement actions last August. You know, the advisors, well, they were duly registered broker-dealers advisors, had cloud-based email services. They didn't have MFA. They didn't update their policies on a regular basis, or they didn't update their policies quick enough once they realized they had an issue. So there are areas, and like most enforcement cases, I mean, again, I'm in the Division of Investment Management, I'm not in enforcement, but they're very fact and circumstances based. So I'm not sure, you know, whether there's gonna be more enforcement. If there's a rule to enforce, perhaps, but again, I can't say. But there is a cyber unit, there has been more of a focus in this area, and the commission has just proposed a set of rules. So I guess, that's sort of the lay of the land.
Without saying anything, what are you saying? So, you know, I know now there is this set of proposed rules, and I know you're not in the Division of Enforcement, but we have seen, and you noted this, we have seen more enforcement actions that relate specifically to cyber issues. Wondering if you could sort of talk about the toolkit that the SEC uses when they are bringing enforcement proceedings and looking at cyber. What are some of the authorities that they are using to bring those actions?
Right. Well, a lot of those authorities there's a Regulation SP, which is a safeguards rule, which I think most people are familiar with. That's with respect to customer information. There's Regulation SID, which is the identity theft rule. I think there's only been really one enforcement case. I think it was the Voya case. I think they could have brought an enforcement case many years earlier, but Reg SID wasn't in place yet. So I think they used a different rule for that case. But it's generally Reg SP and Reg SID. They're very focused, you know, Reg SP is on customer information, Reg SID is identity theft, and now if this proposed rule it will fill sort of what I call sort of a narrow lane, which is it's going to not just be customer information, narrow in the sense that it's going to focus now on the operations of an advisor or a fund. In other words, the information systems and data or information that's residing in those information systems, and that, of course, can be customer information as well, but it could be other information. So it's broader in scope than Reg SP, but it's fitting sort of what I view, at least, as a sleeve that hasn't been filled yet, which these proposed rules, I think, do fill.
And since I'm thinking about it and looking at it, I'm just going to give the second code word for continuing education now. So the second code word for continuing education credit is fireball. All one word. I didn't come up with these words, but it's fireball. FIREBALL.
As opposed to firewall.
Not firewall. Yeah, that is really confusing. It's fireball. But if you write firewall, you can probably get credit. Maria, maybe we sort of bring it to you. We've talked about the threat landscape that's out there. We've talked about the regulatory landscape that's out there. I think, you know, it's fair to say the threat landscape is scary, and the regulatory landscape is maybe also scary, you know, as we're seeing more regulatory action and enforcement. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, from the perspective of the business side of this, given the environment, how can a company prioritize its defenses and its cybersecurity strategies?
Sure. I believe that it begins with knowing your weaknesses. Network, systems, people, knowledge base weaknesses, and that helps you with strategy. In my humble opinion, partnering up with experts in cyber and information security is a critical component of that, because I envision the penetration testing that they can help you do will help you frame out a risk assessment that will then drive your strategy. I believe it falls down to also knowing where your client data is, and that's a big ask in some firms, but working towards developing an inventory of where your client data is so that you know where to throw the defenses. And not just client data, obviously intellectual property and firm data. And then together with knowing your network system and information gaps, this is really where you want to focus your energies. And then of course you segue into the vendor space, knowing your service providers, specifically the ones that have access to those networks and those data. And I think that helps you in this evolving threat landscape to develop a program that is at the very least trying to protect that data.
So I want to touch on something that Wes brought up at the outset, and I think it's a term that is becoming more commonplace as we talk about cybersecurity within our businesses, and that's a concept of proactive versus reactive cybersecurity. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit. What are some of the advantages of being proactive as opposed to, waiting for something to happen to you?
Right. So I believe that being the reactive is a necessary part of the equation. You need to have a good team in place to detect, mitigate, stop, respond to incidents that, according to some of the cyber experts that I've spoken to, are bound to happen. So somebody that was recently a speaker at a webinar that we hosted for our clients likened the threat landscape that we're facing to a common flu. It's not a matter of if you get it, it's when you get it, right? So the when you get it component comes into play, so you must have a good way to respond to that. But obviously, it's always better to be proactive, because I feel that you can prevent something from happening that would have happened if you didn't take a proactive stance. And some examples of that would be, so 2 years ago, before we went on lockdown, I remember being on a panel talking about vendor due diligence and talking about wish lists, how you often feel like you're never doing enough, and you just don't have maybe as many resources as you would like to throw at this very big problem. But I was dreaming, and it became true, and that was that I wanted to have real-time monitoring, threat monitoring in my space at all times, 24/7. Dropping a tool in there that works with AI to monitor for anything that looks suspicious, and then a team of analysts on the side actually reviewing and ruling out what's noise, and then escalating to me whenever they really think there is a threat. So I think I was making that case for that for a while, and now it's a reality, and I think it comes from talking to your teams. So I do concur, it's a team effort. This is a team effort. Our internal IT, our operations, our senior management, compliance, our third-party experts, this is a language, right? Sometimes I need a translator, and they're critical. And so together, we are thinking about what's keeping you up at night, something that I may not have. What makes you uncomfortable? And that helps to drive the direction and the tools that we choose to invest in, because it is an investment. It's not, cheap. And so, yeah, I think those are among the thoughts in terms of proactive and reactive. I think proactive too is training. I remember once upon a time when cybersecurity was something that we trained on an annual basis. That's just not the case anymore. We just can't afford that. So we actually have a space in our town halls for our information security folks to tell us about the latest risk, what are they seeing, or things, specific fish fish scams that they've seen, because they do change little by little. I'm sure you all remember once upon a time we had, an email that said that you had some Arabian prince or Nigerian prince that was your relative, and you all of a sudden inherited, $1 million, and you should contact somebody. But that has changed now. It's so sophisticated. And because of COVID, a lot of folks started to communicate a lot more comfortably via email. So proactive again, and I think most of us are doing it. Now there's alerts in everybody's email that kind of sensitizes you to the fact that an email might be coming from outside when it's posing as if it's coming from your CEO. Nonetheless, you had situations where that didn't work perfectly, and through this whole movement towards communicating more proactively via email, somebody actually was believed that they were getting a communication, an urgent communication or time-sensitive communication from our senior management that ended up being a flaw. And one of the things that we learned from that, fortunately, we didn't act on it and take it to the final level, because we do have a lot of checks and balances in terms of who can sign documents. And so there was a pressure to make an investment that appeared to be serious and real, and so much so that they were encouraged by the senior management to contact a lawyer that was working on a transaction. And there was actually a lawyer that picked up the phone and talked to this person, but it was all a scam. And we got wind of it eventually, because we have a lot of checks and balances around who can sign for these types of investments, and we caught it. And sometimes and I'm sure many of you will share similar stories, it's a subtle thing that tips you off that something is off, And so I think having different types of eyes, people with different perspectives, also helps in keeping us very vigilant and proactive.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said so many really good and important things in that answer, and I wish we had more time to go into them. And it's a shame that the presentation is how long it is, recognizing that there are drinks at the end of it. But it is there's a lot in there to unpack. But I do want to follow up on a couple things. One is I completely agree with you in the sense that the team is important and the buy-in throughout the organization is important. It's not going to work. A program is not going to work if you're not getting buy-in from, not just the technology folks, but from the legal folks, from the executive team. You're not going to have the kind of program that is going to be adequately designed to catch and respond to these types of attacks if you don't have that buy-in. So I think that's crucial. One other thing that I think you touched on there is, in terms of recognizing and responding to attacks and having your people and the right team in place, there's an issue of training, right? Which I think is so important now. Because, at the end of the day, we can design incredibly sophisticated defense systems, but the weakness in most cases is still the human beings, right? The people who click on the link, the people who don't catch the slightly different email address. And so, that's still our weakness in most cases, and the solution to that is training. And I wonder if you could talk about that, talk about what goes into a good training program, what needs to be involved there, what you've seen that's worked, and maybe conversely, what hasn't worked.
I think what hasn't worked was making it a once-a-year thing. But also, we tried to vary it up. We created this space where we teach by example. This happened, these are the types of incidents that we're seeing, real case studies, I guess we would call them. And then more formalized training, sometimes leveraging the expertise of all these different providers out there that are willing to share their knowledge. So I've rolled out webinars hosted and provided by experts in the field, as well as sometimes leveraging your custodian. They also host really good webinars that we've invited all our employees to participate in so they get sensitized to the different types of issues that custodians are facing. And then separately, just sending them alerts, emails. So it's a combination of all that.
Wondering if you could also comment on sort of the regulatory environment and the perception of regulators like the SEC, and David, you can plug your ears if you want, but one thing I've noticed as we've worked with clients over the course of the last couple of years is a shift in the perception by regulators. What used to be a prevailing view of if you got attacked, you were a victim. Your company was a victim if you suffered an attack. I don't think that's the case any longer. And my perception is the view of the SEC and other regulators. It's now if you got attacked, what did you do wrong? And what could you have done better? Or were you being negligent? And I'm curious from where you sit, is that the sense you have now as you deal with regulators? Do you feel like they lend you, support or cooperation in these types of situations, or is it really like they're going to be there looking over your shoulder after an incident occurs and pointing out everything that you didn't do right?
So I will knock on wood because I haven't been in the crosshairs of the SEC in regard to cyber, but I will say that the cyber initiative they announced their cyber initiative in 2014, and through sweep exams, at least 9 risk alerts related to the topic, then enforcement, and now the rule. I think it's a natural progression, and that the SEC puts a lot of work, and I'm not giving a plug to the SEC, but they do put a lot of work on the risk alerts. And I do believe that if we ignore them, it's sort of at our own peril. And I will say that when I saw the rule, yes, there's very prescriptive elements in it, and I do have some issues with the reporting requirement. But if I'm just looking at, for example, the policies and procedures requirements, it does look to me like I could say check, 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 and maybe a lot of us can on a lot of the things that were in the rule, because it has been pretty transparently communicated over time.
One final question I wanted to ask you, and then I'll open up to a couple final thoughts by the panel. Wes had touched on this issue as well, on the issue of cyber insurance, and we're seeing businesses now. Wes said it, I think, best. If you don't have it, you're going to have it. But it's becoming, from my perspective, increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive. And curious as to your thoughts about that process and how it's changed, and any advice you might have for people dealing with, renewal or getting new cyber insurance.
So I remember around 2015 when I believe we got our first cyber insurance policy, and the insurers definitely did some level of due diligence, and obviously because cash or money transfers are one of the top concerns, they did have some control requirements with regard to whether they would take you on as an insured. And among them were, what are your cash management procedures? Are you using multi-factor authentication? And absolutely, I've seen evolution in terms of spikes in premiums as a result of the increase in cyber attacks in general. But it also reminds me a little bit of our health insurance. You're great, and you will get a better rate if you don't have a pre-existing condition. So certainly have seen the move in the direction of not wanting to cover firms that have had cyber incidents, and also doing a lot more testing. So like looking at your IP addresses and getting color on them on top of the requirement that you have strong money movement and have implemented multi-factor authentication across the organization wherever it's available. And it's interesting also for me to notice that once upon a time, multi-factor authentication was something that you had to fight to try to implement because it puts a speed bump in everybody's desire to work. They consider it less efficient, but now it's just outright required. And I think that's just the new reality that we're going to live with.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I think I had sort of an interesting moment in terms of looking at insurance. One of our clients was re-upping its policy, and we saw, the questionnaire that they got from the insurer, and, it's almost, without saying so, it's almost like, a cybersecurity framework in and of itself, right? The number of questions, the specificity of the questions. We're almost getting to a point where if you are not adhering to an accepted cybersecurity framework like ISO or NIST or something like that, you're going to have a hard time getting insurance. Or if you're going to get it, it's going to be prohibitively expensive. And so it's just interesting to see.
We could push back a little bit on that because we're not subject to NIST. But at the same time, I believe that it is to our benefit anyway to look through the terms of the cyber insurance. I think you asked me this question, maybe I didn't answer it, but get clear on what they do cover. And I find that a lot of them, they have like a list of providers through which they would expect you to work in the event that you would have a cyber event, and that some of the providers are like the top tier, which is great, but they also come with a high, price. So I think getting clear on the terms is the best advice that I would give. What do they cover? Because even if you have an event, they will probably cover everything, and they'll probably fire you the next year, and so you will need to shop for another one anyway.
On that high note, we have just a couple minutes left here, and I want to give each of the panelists a minute to sort of provide a takeaway on this topic. Obviously, I don't think we're going to have time to go into questions to the extent people have them, but certainly, feel free to come up and ask myself or anybody if you do have questions. So maybe Wes, we start with you. I want to give each of you an opportunity. We've talked a lot about the threat landscape, the regulatory landscape. What's your 1 minute takeaway here of what people should walk out of this presentation with?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about some pretty scary things, a lot of expenses, but the fact of the matter is there are answers out there, and there are good providers, and we can get proactive. Nobody can be 100%. Nobody's going to guarantee anything. But we've come a long ways in just a couple of years from technology and an understanding standpoint. So it's there. We can get there. There's no doubt about that.
Maria?
Email monitoring, so having a good system to quarantine. There's a lot of sophistication available now with regard to that. Patch management, a lot of the ransomware issues happen because of vulnerabilities that don't get fixed quickly enough, so understanding that for yourself and for your vendors. Pen testing, fish testing, risk assessment, and partnering up with a great cyber firm, and shaking it up once in a while.
But before you jump, I just want to add one more thing. You reminded me of something with the patch management. If you're running your computer as an administrator, I suggest you stop doing it right now. You should not be running as an administrator on any device.
And last but not least, David.
We have the commission proposed a set of rules. The commission has asked for comments. If something doesn't work, or you think creates issues, or something does work, we'd like to hear from you. So please do comment. Again, they're proposed, they're in the proposal stage, so please take the opportunity to comment on them.
And with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists and really appreciate the thoughts and insight that all three of you brought to the panel today, and really appreciate everybody in the audience's time as well. And with that, on to cocktail hour.
Thanks, Pete.